It's Joe Partavilla, and thanks for taking the time to check out a new episode of the Forbes Books podcast. And when you were growing up, the phrase wealth management was akin to craniotomy. You knew it was something that was done, but didn't actually know how people did it. A few years ago, I was working on a show, and one day this newbie 20-something producer walks in the studio and complains about the fact that the business office had signed him up for something called a 401k, and that they were taking money away from him. Needless to say, a long, drawn-out conversation then took place. Obviously, when it comes to wealth management, or a craniotomy for that matter, you're better off working with an expert. And today I'm spending time with Zachary Garber, a vice president and client advisor at Alex. Brown, a division of Raymond James. His specialties include custom portfolios that overlay alternative investments, including private equity, hedge funds, and real estate solutions. Hello, Zach.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
I'm good. And, I want to start with talking about this lineage and the fact that money management is in your blood. Talk to me about following your dad's footsteps.
Sure. My father started in this business about 30 years ago, and it was really a second or third career for him, and ended up starting over again in the wealth management program at Alex. Brown, and really approached this business from an asset allocation standpoint. And I think, you go back to early 90s, most people were commission brokers. The idea of asset allocation was,
money was flowing everywhere.
And so he always took the approach of, how would I allocate our family's money? How can I do that for other people? And rather than a trading mentality, what is a long-term asset allocation approach, which I think was very different back then. And I remember in college, I actually had a startup, and my junior year of college, I sat down with my father. I said, what if I come to work with you? He said, I'm not hiring you. I said, what do you mean? He said, you need to have at least 10 years of industry experience and get your MBA from Harvard or Wharton and do the CFA. If you do that, you can give me a call. That's effectively what I did. And then, I sat down with my dad and I said, why should I work with you? I have 10 years of industry experience, my CFA and my MBA. But no, it's been great working with my father. Obviously, I've known him my whole life, and he's a great guy, a great mentor, role model of mine, both professionally, community, personally. And it's been a pleasure working with him.
Wow. And so your dad was not a big fan of nepotism, it sounds like, huh?
Well, I think he wanted this. Incentives, as I mentioned, are aligned, right? And for me to come in to work in our practice where we oversee billions of dollars, I really need to be able to show that I am in a position to help our clients and to really be the best person to work on the team. And I think that's what I showed. And I think that's important, because otherwise, exactly what you said, it would be nepotism. So I really wanted to go over and beyond in terms of my credentials, my industry experience, before I even considered working with my father. And for anyone who has a family business, I think building up your own credentials, your personal experience is extremely important before working with family.
I don't know if it's just we notice it more now, but Zach, I don't know if you agree with this, but now more than ever, you see a lot of professional athletes who are children of professional athletes. Back in the day when I was growing up, you'd have a random junior, but now it seems like it's so common. And I want to just kind of draw a parallel with you. Is it genetic? Like the idea that you, and not necessarily the wealth management side of it, but like that sort of brain power that you have kicking in lends itself because it's handed down genetically. Is that possible?
I mean, I guess this always gets back to nature versus nurture, right? And if we think about it, I think a lot of it is probably nurture, is the environment, right? This is something that I've grown up with. And, my dad, I'm very fortunate, had built a successful practice, and it was just a great opportunity to work with him. And I think, as it relates to professional athletes, I'm sure they are around somebody who's trained, has been successful, and they've seen that their entire life in terms of being modeled for them. As it relates to this business, I'm not sure if it's quite as much physical strength.
Right. And last question on this. Did you ever see yourself doing anything else? Or was this were you a one-track kid?
No, I mean, I had multiple different paths. I had a couple startups throughout my life. I actually started a business in college with my co-founder, ultimately decided that I wanted to go work for one of the large banks, and worked for Deutsche Bank afterwards, and sold the business to my college friend and co-founder, and then went back and did my MBA at Wharton, and had to I thought this was a great opportunity to both continue to develop professionally, but also explore whether or not working with my father and continuing to stay in wealth management was the right path. And ultimately, found this really intellectually fulfilling, and also felt like I could help people, which is why I determined to go into this business versus when I was in my MBA program, I had a fantasy sports startup, which was very interesting at the time, but realized that that was not going to be fulfilling as a long-term career option.
And I'd love to get your take on this because maybe someone's listening and they're dabbling with the idea of going for their MBA. What do you feel like is, and obviously Wharton, one of the top business schools on the planet, what do you feel you got most out of going to like one of these high level MBA programs as opposed to just, doing the school of hard knocks or, working your way up the corporate ladder? What was your big takeaway that you tell folks like, this was my big takeaway from getting my MBA?
Sure, I think that's a great question. I think it's really 2 years to get perspective and to focus on what it is that you really want to do and step back from the day-to-day grind. So if you have the opportunity, having gone to, as you mentioned, a tier one program, I felt like I was able to continue to grow my skill set and learn while also learning not just in the classroom, but from all my classmates about what it is they were doing, learning about completely different career options, dabbling and learning more about the startup ecosystem. It gave me an opportunity to step out of my day-to-day routine working, 60 to 70 hours a week in New York to really figure out what it is that I want to do long-term and make that decision.
And it's funny when I speak to folks who went to either Wharton or Columbia, as an outsider, someone not as educated as you guys, I always think like, man, those must be cutthroat school because these are business people. And it's like, from what I understand, it's like the exact opposite. Everyone's in it together and they're all helping. It's not like these horror stories you hear about med school or something like that. You guys are almost like a fraternity sorority, right? In terms of during that 2-year pursuit of the MBA?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a collaborative environment. That being said, there is competition absolutely in the classroom amongst people, but I think that people are really there to figure out what it is they want to do in terms of their next steps in life, which is a little bit different than, trying to compete for the same jobs out of law school or out of medical school. So there's lots of different paths and everybody comes with kind of a different background, having already worked typically for, 3 to 10 years in some sort of professional field. So I think it's a little bit different coming out. I also think that as you learn from the different professors, it's great to be back in that academic setting and thinking a little bit more about practice versus academia and what works in both, and having that mindset of having come from working full-time and then going back to academia and then going to academia and then back to work again gives you a really great way to explore how to, best do whatever it is you do professionally.
Yeah, it's funny. I never thought about that because most of the MBAs I've spoken to have done what you said. They graduated college, then they got a job, and then they went to MBA. It's funny. It's not like those other career tracks where it's like you're almost doing this continuing education. It's sort of just like this stop along the way that you're taking on. I've never thought about that.
Yeah, I think really it's a potential pivot point in someone's life, and it's a way to do it and continue to enhance your learning. So there aren't many opportunities, unlike college where you're both learning a lot, getting to know people socially and developing as a person while also developing professionally. And I think that's what that opportunity provided. And that was the reason that I thought it was worthwhile, because it's a difficult decision deciding whether or not to go back to school full time for 2 years when you're making a salary.
And so, then out of the MBA, you got a burgeoning career. You got obviously your dad as your mentor. You're now a VP client advisor with Alex Brown, which is a division of Raymond James. And let's key in on building wealth management and that plan. For folks who are sort of, like me, who pretty much their wealth management plan was sort of inherited by their job. You took this job with this one company and they either had a Fidelity or a Raymond James or something like that. So a lot of people don't realize that they really have more freedom and flexibility than just getting the 401k they have at their job. So talk to me about that, people who are trying to find the right plan for themselves. And it's not just the Oh, okay. I just got this 401k in my job.
Yeah, and I think our job, I think you brought it up, it's very important, is both putting together a wealth management plan and then also the investment side of the business. And thinking about a plan involves not just yourself, but your family, right? If there are assets that you're potentially going to inherit through your family or from other loved ones in your life versus what it is you're building yourself. And I
Mm.
think it's important to see the forest from the trees. So understanding, how much you save, but also how to invest and what is the amount of risk and liquidity that you're willing to take. And then you mentioned 401k, making sure that you're maximizing all your different retirement assets that you can be doing, as well as also thinking about, particularly when someone is starting a young family, things as a 529 savings plan for
Mm.
kids. You want to think about insurance needs, not necessarily as an investment, but God forbid something happens and there's a loss of income in the household, and other tax planning and considerations as well. So I think, what we always try to do is have a thoughtful conversation with our clients to ensure long-term success. So it's not about any one year, because wealth is really generated over time. I think people forget that the most powerful wealth builder is compounding, and that compounding wealth comes from exponential growth, consistently hitting singles and doubles over long periods of time.
Which sort of flies in the face of the of the time we're living in now, Zach. So, how do you either coach folks or talk them through the level of aggressiveness they should take part in when it comes to wealth management?
Sure. I think this is a very important topic today with meme trading. Everyone's focused on very short term growth. And I think what it is we try to step back is we look at asset class assumptions over 10, 20 years. What is the level of risk? What is the level of return? Investing over very long periods of time in the largest corporations in the US has continued to be a very, very successful strategy. And then diversifying, through international markets and other vehicles. I think what's important is how do we consistently build returns for people that are in line with the risk that they're willing to take, and not focus on near-term trading or volatility or political positions that are taking place. Of course, we need to be cognizant of the environment we're investing in, but we also need to be long-term oriented, because as I mentioned, the most powerful thing in investing is really time.
Mm.
And if you can find successful strategies with lower turnover over long periods of time to grow your wealth, that's going to consistently provide you the most stable and best outputs. And I think stability is key for a lot of people. They generate most of their wealth from their jobs,
Mm.
from what it is, from investing in their companies, from that exactly. And this is a way to build passive investments over time. And how do you consistently do that in a way that's going to lead to success?
And how do you avoid that third rail of being like, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that? Like, how do you talk people down in terms of, how aggressive they want to be, or not aggressive they want to be? I mean, do you have, is it almost like you have to play like a therapist role in there when you have sort of like this white glove treatment when it comes to your clients?
Sure. I mean, all of our portfolios for our clients are all customized. So I think one is there isn't a correct answer. There's a spectrum depending on how much risk and liquidity you're willing to take, as long as there's a consistent methodology. I think that's important, right? Taking risks for the sake of taking risks
Mm.
does not necessarily lead to returns. I think, some people think, if I take a lot of risk, I'm going to hit a lot of returns. That's not always the case. So the way we try to think about portfolios is how can we provide the best risk adjusted returns over time? And how do we define risk, right? We think about risk, it can be the volatility over time, as well as downside tail risk events, such as what happened recently with COVID when the markets declined. That is an aberration outside of normal event that you can't really plan for. So we need to look at what happened in '08, what happened in the first quarter during COVID, to understand what is the extreme tail risk, as well as what are the normal range of returns and possibilities over 5, 10 year periods of time, based on the current interest rate environment and valuations being somewhat more expensive than they've been traditionally. So these are all the different components we think through. We talk with people, and I think one of the areas that some of our clients who are qualified purchasers over certain SEC guidelines, they also look at some low correlating assets, such as hedge funds, private equity, private credit. Some of these illiquid private placement opportunities are places where these alternative vehicles don't necessarily have one-for-one correlation to the markets. So I think to answer your question, we very specifically walk through what the expectations are, what we also think are reasonable. If we have a client who comes to us and says that they're looking for 40% returns a year, that's just not a client that I'm going to work with, because I think you need to set reasonable expectations based on the current market environment, historical performance, and what we predict moving forward. And sometimes, if anything, we set expectations slightly lower, because it's a lot better to be surprised to the upside than it is to the downside.
Oh,
People seem to
yeah.
always be more excited about having more money, is what I have found.
It's always the under promise, over deliver thing. And on that 40% growth thing, have you actually had people come in and say, I want to see 40 growth return on this?
I mean, there are people that say all sorts of things, right? And I think it's, what's important is that we try to be rational and thoughtful and provide advice, knowing that I don't know all the answers, nor does any other financial or other professional. What we can do is we can help our clients plan, appropriately for building a wealth plan. We can also help them look at the investment universe and tell them what strategies it is we like and why. And then we can set expectations around what it is we hope to do consistently over long periods of time. Predicting what's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months is extremely difficult and really not the business we're in. As I mentioned, our goal is to continuously hit singles and doubles and allow compounding to really help our clients grow and build their wealth.
And I want to circle back to, you mentioned COVID and the pandemic. Were you surprised, being in the wealth management space, of the sort of that hockey shape curve that it took that quickly? Like, I was just talking to a money manager now, and I didn't even know this, but they said that the recession only lasted 2 months, which is like, it's hard to believe that there was only a 2-month recession during this really tumultuous time. So were you surprised at how quickly that uptick happened?
Yeah, honestly, I think most people were. But I think the other piece of it is things tend to overcorrect and then overreact, right? And in the depths of the pandemic, the markets, even solid companies that we think about that had good prospects, even if we were staying at home, had declined substantially. So I think it's keeping that long-term perspective that we talked about. That was an opportunity to look at the markets. And, I had been talking to clients 2 months earlier that all of a sudden, if the market is down 30%, you think about this, if someone's going to buy some sort of clothing at a store and they put a 20% sale sign in, everyone gets really excited and buys. When the market declines 20%, everyone is typically in panic mode and ready to sell. So I think it's, continuing to think about what is the long-term perspective view, where valuations have been, and adding at those types of times is very important. Now, the magnitude and the quickness of the reaction of the market, I think, took a lot of people by surprise. But we also had an unprecedented level of government stimulus that came out. We're also in a unique interest rate time right now with the Fed coming out. So I think the level of response from government, along with the stability that was brought to the market, led to a much quicker reaction. And you're now seeing people really wanting to get back into doing things again, and it's led to strong GDP numbers. Now, what's going to happen moving forward, unfortunately, with this Delta variant and other things are absolutely concerning. But I think, once again, taking a 10, 20-year approach to investing allows you to think a little bit more through what your goals are and how you can get there.
I'm curious, Zach, because we mentioned earlier that your dad has been doing this for a long time, and I don't know if maybe it's just because I'm older, but I feel like the wealth management space when I was a kid was like an old guy with a monocle. And I feel like more people now are more, either whether it's they're more cognizant of it, they're more aware of it. Maybe you've spoken to your dad about this, but like, are people more involved in sort of their wealth management now than they were, say, 20 years ago to 30 years ago?
I think it depends on what you mean by people being involved, right? A lot of the barriers to entry for people that don't necessarily have as much wealth have basically gone away with, no commission brokerage
Mm.
accounts and the ease and facility of trading and technology and access to the markets. But as it relates to families that have, significant wealth that they've built up, hiring an advisor is, as important as it is today as it was 20 years ago. And they really look to have the right types of advisors to help guide them. And then also, I think the other piece right now is the average financial advisor, is much older than myself. You think about most financial advisors, they are much older, just like you mentioned.
Mm.
But I think similar to when you look at your health, you look at your doctor, it's really important to have a plan that's going to outlive you, but also is going to be there for 20, 30 years. So one of the things that we've done on our team is ensure, I work with my father who has decades of industry of experience, but, I'm also on the team to ensure that, I can implement a plan for the next 30, 40 years. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about that, and ensuring that you're going to have somebody who can implement your plan and is going to survive you is really important. And then also facilitate those multi-generational conversations that take place, which is so difficult. So, being able to relate to a younger generation and the older generation and bridge that gap is something that is crucially important today when you need to have these difficult conversations around money.
And yeah, so let's get into these multi-generational goals. How do you handle that on the ground level?
Yeah, I think the first step is always talking to the person who owns the wealth, right? It is ultimately that person's goals, objectives, it's their money, that we need to ensure that we are providing them the right resources to meet their goals, their expectations. Now, if you have someone of an older generation who wants to bring in other family members, at that point in time, it's sitting down and, explaining what the path has been thus far in terms of the goals, the strategies. A lot of times we develop what we would call an internal IPS or investment policy statement, which is a framework that ensures that you have a consistent long-term methodology for success. Now, as you talk about wealth transfer, this can change over time. The goals can change, right? If someone has amassed enough wealth that they're no longer worried about their retirement, that might change the risk liquidity goals that they have for their money. But I think both ensuring that the next generation understands what the strategy has been up to this point, and then also how you can include them in the conversation so that over time, as they learn more, as they educate themselves, as we're here as a resource to educate them, they can then make informed decisions and come to the table to be part of the conversation, part of the decision making.
And so you drop some acronyms along the way, which I like to call acronym soup every once in a while. But when you're speaking to your the clients, what kind of benchmarks do you use? I know they call them like straw man benchmarks in terms of like goals beating the Standard & Poor's, beat the S&P 500. Do you have benchmarks that you like to lean on?
Sure. I think benchmarks are important and it's something to understand. And I think the way we think about it is it depends on each investment. And then you can look at a blended benchmark based on a portfolio. So, if we have an institution that says, I can't lose a cent and I'm just looking for cash management, of course, we're not going to be comparing them, to the S&P 500. We're going to be comparing them to short-term T-bills, right? Versus, what most people think about when they think about benchmarks is the S&P 500, which are the 500 largest companies in the U.S. That's a relevant benchmark if you're investing with a large cap, U.S. manager and you're investing in large cap U.S. companies. That being said, if you're investing in small cap companies, smaller businesses, if you're investing in international businesses, that's not necessarily the appropriate benchmark. So I think what is important about benchmarks is that we set benchmarks that are appropriate based on the investments you're making. And then the other thing is also what is the absolute returns you're looking to hit, right? We talked about risk-adjusted returns. So we're not just looking at returns, we're also looking to help people preserve wealth, because a lot of our clients, they spend 30, 40 years working full time to generate the wealth it is that they have. So it's not always trying to hit the maximum return. It's trying to hit the level of return they can with ensuring that they're not going to lose the nest egg that they've built. So I think when we think about benchmarks, it's based on, what is the amount of risk you're willing to take? What is it in terms of the amount of liquidity that you need? And then what is it in terms of your investments and your asset allocation? And then we can back into the appropriate benchmarks to ensure that the investments are doing what they should. And then when we think about things over time, I think this is actually even more important, is when something either exceeds or is doing worse than the benchmark, how do you make that decision to replace an investment or stick with it? And I think you have to be consistent in reviewing longer term performance and also ensuring that there hasn't been turnover of managers, and the consistency and the methodology is still the same and nothing has materially changed. I mean, what we hope to do is to work with various investment funds, investment managers, strategies that are intended to be 10-year plus time horizons. And, we look at rolling 3, 5, and 10 years to continuously evaluate how they're doing relative to what we expect and their peers and the benchmarks that they've identified.
And your philosophy there is you're active management, not passive, correct?
We actually we deal with a lot of active management, particularly in this environment. But I would say that I'm not necessarily always interested in active. I'm open to active or passive, right? There is a benefit to having cheap passive exposure. That being said, over long periods of time, there are active managers in different asset classes that have proven that they can outperform over long periods of time, or at least have done so historically, and on a forward-looking basis, we like working with them. So we have a mix of active and passive management. I think what's most important is making sure that you have the right asset allocation, and then we can have those conversations about each asset class, whether or not it makes sense to buy cheap passive exposure to track an index versus hiring a manager, and why hiring a manager is worth it on a net basis after fees.
And lastly on this, when folks sign up to work with you or any kind of money manager, I think one of the questions is, how often do you update my plan? Now that I'm in the door, you got my money. How often do you look into this and make sure everything is copacetic? Do you guys have a plan in place as to how often you do that?
Sure. I mean, we meet with clients at least annually. That's the bare minimum. Yeah. But I would say that, we're running internal performance reports monthly and quarterly on all of our clients and evaluating how they're doing. And meet with clients as frequently as every few weeks to twice a year. And I think the big thing is to make sure that there haven't been any major life changes or any other major events that would change what their long-term investment perspective is. But this is not something that we would change on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis on a regular basis, because we just got through talking about how part of working with us is trying to compound over long periods of time, hit singles and doubles, and see the forest from the trees. So if we're changing every month, that wouldn't necessarily be helpful. But that being said, we also do look for investments tactically that make sense, and probably look at different changes throughout the years. But as it relates to reevaluating someone's portfolio and completely changing what it is they're doing or reassessing the portfolio, I would say at least on an annual basis, could be as frequently as quarterly, but over long periods of time, hopefully we have a somewhat consistent methodology with tactical changes as we see things shift.
And lastly, Zach, why do you have this job? Why do you do this? What makes you wake up every day and help people grow their wealth? What is it about this job that really gets you going?
I mean, a couple different things. One, I think it's intellectually interesting, following the markets, trying to understand what's going on, also learning from our clients how they've built their wealth, what it is that they do, their perspectives on what's going on in the markets. I'm constantly learning. I think that's probably the most interesting thing about the job. The other piece is also being able to be a trusted advisor. what is it that people value the most in their lives, beyond their families, their relationships. One of the things that people value most is their wealth. And so people are trusting you with one of their most important assets that they own to help manage and make those decisions. And we take that responsibility very, very seriously. And I look to do for my clients what I would do if I was in their shoes. And that's really the way I think about it. And we really try to work with people for 20, 30 years. I'm not out to sell specific product or to find the next great investment. I'm here to be an advisor to help guide people to ensure that they have success and they have the right expectations, as they invest, because investing can be a very stressful, concerning process, but it's something that's extremely important. So I think being there for people, identifying and helping guide them to be able to define for themselves what is the amount of risk that they're actually looking to take. Just a simple question like that is not necessarily so easy for someone to answer. So we go through questionnaires. We spend a lot of time working with people to ensure that they put together the right plan for them that's successful, and then constantly evaluating investments, the current market environment. I think that's really interesting. And then the last piece is, I would say that being involved in the community in this job, one of the great things about this job is I've been able to work with a wide variety of people and also get involved in community impact, trying to make a difference, within my community and also access to other communities. And I think you're in a unique standpoint when you're in client service, meeting with different people from all across the country on a regular basis.
You've come a long way since fantasy baseball there, Zach. He is Zachary Garber, the Vice President and Client Advisor at Alex. Brown, a division of Raymond James. Zachary, thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Joe, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome, Zachary, and that is it for this edition of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.